Hello again. In the previous film, I analyzed the creation story and the Eden narrative, how they belong together, and the relationship very shortly. In this film, I will continue with chapter 4 and then the Toledot of Adam, or the Toledot of man, until the flood. So please follow me here. I will say actually very little about chapter 4, the history of Cain and Abel, but I just want to show you one thing. In the story of Cain and Abel, chapter 4, there is used an inclusio. An inclusio means that the first part of a unit, you can, in the last part of it, you can recognize the same words, the same theme again. And this is to understood as a conclusion of one unit, one whole. The first sentence in chapter 4 says, Ha-Adam, which means then the man, had Yada, that had intimate relations with Eve, his woman. He slept with her. Yada is perfect. And she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have got or formed Kaniti, the word is Kaniti, a man from the Lord. This Kaniti here is the reason, I think, for the name Cain, Kaniti Cain. In the last two verses, the second part of the inclusio starts with and Adam. Now it's not Ha-Adam, which means man normally. It's just Adam, the name of the man. Vayeda Adam Od. This is now the same word as here. Normally it means to know, or knowledge, to be knowledgeable, to be able to do something. But here it stands for having sexual intercourse, which is used especially in chapter 3 and 4. Vayeda Adam Od. So it's grammatical variation. With his woman. Notice here in the first sentence, the name of the man is not mentioned, but the name of the woman is Eve. In the second part of the inclusio, Adam, the name of the man is mentioned, but not the name of the woman. Sometimes in the literature you can find, this is strange, why is not her name, Eve's name mentioned? But the reason is, I'm sure, personally sure, that the reason is, again, this is chiastic or variation. Here is not the man's name, here it is. Here is the woman's name, here it is not. And she gave birth to a son. Here is a variation again. And Cain gave birth to Cain. Here is said, and she gave birth to a son. And then the name is here, and she called his name Shet. And again, as in the beginning, an explanation for the name, because Shat in Hebrew, given me, has God another seed instead of Abel, because killed him Cain. So here again, an explanation for the name Shet is Shat. So this strengthens the idea that Kaniti is the reason for the name of Cain. Notice that here in the first part of the inclusio is the name of the Lord. It's the name of God used. The tetragrammaton. Yud Hei Vav Hei. JHWH. But here is just Elohim, the appellative. Elohim is not a name. Elohim is like, it can be used for different gods. It can be used also for mighty people, or even normal people. It's like between the city and New York. New York is a name of a city. City is like God. New York is like the Lord, the tetragrammaton. And if you know the documentary hypothesis, then you know that what strongest shows the different sources, which doesn't have anything to do with each other, is the name of God, the Tetragrammaton, used, or is just Elohim, God, used. And here is Tetragrammaton in the first part and God in the second, Elohim. That means you should consider these verses have nothing to do with each other. Of course, you can say that is ridiculous. It's so very more than clear that these verses belong together as an inclusio. But it is a problem if you believe that the documentary hypothesis is correct about the primeval history. And note the variations again. We didn't have time to look at them in this presentation in the film I did before, part 1, but it's the same kind of variation you find time and time again in the creation story, and also which we later will see in the flood story, in the parts that are described as P sections in the documentary hypothesis. Also in the creation story there is an inclusio used. So it's the same kind of techniques. This should be J, according to documentary hypothesis. And to say that these verses has nothing to do with each other, it just means that you really believe the theory and thus don't look at the text, the empirical material, I would say. Then the ending of the Toledot is about where it's told that also to Shet, also unto him was born a son, and he called his name Enosh. At that time he started to call on the name of the Lord, the Tetragrammaton. Also this part is very clear, belongs together with Adam, had again intimate relations with his woman, and she gave birth to a son, and so on. Very clear. Even unto him was born a son. But notice again, here is the Tetragrammaton, the name of the Lord, used. Here is just Elohim. That again means, if you believe the documentary hypothesis, you should say that these verses have nothing to do with each other. Again, I would say that is very strange if you think that they don't. If you look at these texts, it's very clear these verses belong together. But if you believe the documentary hypothesis, here is really a problem. So, different sources, I don't think so. The text doesn't support it. So, now we have come to the end of the Toledot of heaven and earth, which started with the Eden narrative and ends with these verses, history about Cain and Abel. And we can hear about Shet and Enosh. What is to be expected then in the next unit? The next unit is the Toledot of Adam, or the Toledot of man. What is to be expected? Yes, we should expect a Toledot formula, which starts another unit. We should expect an introduction, where the Vayiktal form, the narrative form, is not used, and then the story starts with the narrative form. Let's see what we find. Before I look at the beginning of this unit, notice that this unit doesn't end in chapter 5. It continues until chapter 6, verse 8. As everybody today knows, the chapters in the primeval history are in many places not good at all. The one who did make out these chapters didn't understand how the text is composed. So in many times the chapter doesn't end where unit ends. So also in this case it starts at the right place, but doesn't end at the right place, unfortunately. And I would say everybody agrees to that today. So it starts with, this is the Sefer, the book, the writing of the Toledot of Adam. Adam means man. And I have here, in my translation in Swedish, I use man. And the reason for that is, among others, that you really should notice that this unit continues to verse 8 in chapter 6. And I think it's important for a meaningful understanding of these units, correct understanding. What should come next? Yes, an introduction. And that is exactly what we find. The day God was to create man, to the likeness of God he did her. Man and woman he created them, and he blessed them. Yes, he called their name man the day they were created. This is an introduction where the narrative form is not used. And after that, the story starts, or the Adam's genealogy starts. Notice that it's Adam is used all 3 times. The second and third time, everybody translates it to man, not the name Adam. It's clear that you should understand it as man. And I think it's the best way is to understand it as man also the first time. It's the continued history of man, not Adam. You can also notice the first Toledot is the Toledot of heaven and earth. The heaven and earth was in place already. The creation story hasn't any Toledot formula. It is not the continued history of anything. It's the start. And here the second starts with man is in place. The continued history of man. And the next Toledot will be the Toledot of Noah. Noah is already there, and it's the history about him. So I really think the continued history, the Toledot of man, is the best way to understand the start of this unit. Let's see quickly just the introduction again. You notice that also here the writer uses an inclusive, which is a chiastic construction, but it's more correct to call this inclusive. You find in the first sentence, the day God was to create man. And in the last sentence in the introduction, yes, he, variation with God, called their name man, again man, the day, again the day, they created, bara, created, with grammar variations, variations in grammar and substitution and word order. So again, variation of this writer P, who according to the documentary hypothesis should have a bad literary skills, who would love monotonous repetition, word for word repetitions. Again, it doesn't fit this text at all, the description of P. I would say everybody can easily recognize that this introduction links very clearly to the creation story. It's almost word for word in the first sight, but it's not, as we will see. But you can get, you all straight away start to think about the creation story, of course, where it said God created man to his image. To God's image he created her. Man and woman he created them, and God blessed them. That is Genesis 1:27. But again, notice the variations. Here in the introduction to the Toledot of man, it's used bara in infinitive constructus, bero. In the creation story, it's vayiktol, vayivra. In the creation story it said, God yivra man to his image. Here in the introduction it's just said God bero man. It is not said to his image. Then it says, then it comes also here in the man's toledot, to the image of God he made her. To the image of God he created her. Very interestingly, the writer used different words. In the creation story it's Betzelem. Here in the introduction, chapter 5, it's bidemut. Different words, means the same, but different words. Then you have Elohim, and in creation story it's used bara, create. In the Eden narrative, asa, which is like make. It's not synonymous with bara, but part of the meaning of asa is the same. But asa can mean very different things, which I will look at explain in another presentation. To man and woman he created them, and God, in creation story it said, and God blessed them. In chapter 5 it said, and he blessed them. So again, very clearly linked together with the creation story and the creating of man, but again uses not the same words. He have many variations. Again, this writer, who shouldn't be skilled, who shouldn't use variations, but only monotonous repetitions. He doesn't. And can notice that it's the same kind of grammar and other variations as is used in chapter 4, in the inclusion chapter 4 I explained to you earlier. These are supposed to be completely different writers with completely different style, but here is used the same skillful kind of variation in both of these, which should be different writers. After the introduction, the genealogy of Adam, and here it's really Adam, it's the man Adam and his offspring, which is in this genealogy told about. And it's also links to what? It says here, he fathered one to his likeness, as his image, a son, and he called his name Shet. Where have you heard about Shet before? Yes, you have heard about him in the end of chapter 4, in the end of the unit that is supposed to be written by J. So, here the writer links again, not to the creation story this time, but to the Toledot of heaven and earth. Very clearly, again he mentions Shet. But we have already heard about him. Adam had relations with this woman, and intimate relations with this woman, and she gave birth to a son and called his name Shet. And in chapter 4, the reason for his name is given. God has shot me, given me another seed instead of Abel. Here, in chapter 5, the reason for the name is not mentioned, which you already got in chapter 4. But you get a lot of new information about how long Adam lived, that this one, Shet, was to Adam's likeness, image. And you get to know how long Adam lived after he had fathered Shet, and that he fathered sons and daughters, whose names of course we don't know, and how long he lived altogether, and that he died. If you watch the computer, watch my presentation, everything in yellow is new. So you don't get the repetition about the same information, but you get a clear link. The same man, the same son, but not the same information, but new information. This is a typical technique found throughout the primeval history, which I talk about here. So notice that in the beginning of the Toledot of Man, chapter 5, that unit links both to the creation story and the Toledot of heaven and earth. Not only to the creation story, which you can find in many commentaries, that opinion. It's simply not true. It links also to the Toledot of heaven and earth. So it links to everything that has been before. Then I just want to show you make you aware of these variations found between the first generation and the second. If you read it not carefully, and if you read translations to Swedish or some in English, the translators have harmonized the text so you can't even see in Swedish, for instance, sometimes these variations. But in the Hebrew text they are there. For Adam it said he fathered a son to his likeness. The next generation, Shet, it just said he fathered Enosh. About Adam it said, and Adam's days was. About Shet it said, and Shet lived. Different words. About Adam it said, all of Adam's days as he lived were 930 years. About Shet it said, all Shet's days, the as he lived is left away, just said all of Shet's days 12 years and 900 years. In Adam, the hundreds of years comes before, and the tens of years afterwards. In Shet's is the other way round. First, lower numbers, 12, and then the hundreds of years. This variation with the number of years is not an accident. It's very clear when you analyze it that this is really something the author has thought about. And if you read my analysis of Adam's Toledot, or the Toledot of man, I have it there very clearly, but I will not show it in this presentation. After this, there are actually 4 generations that are identical. Word for word. 4 generations, absolutely word for word repetitions. Generations 3 to 6. But then, conformity, contrast, variation. Generation 7 is then a big variation. If in the genealogy of Cain, which you find in chapter 4, we haven't looked at it, but there you find the number 7 from Adam is Lemech, who was boasting about how he will kill a man for a bruise. Generation 7 from Adam in the genealogy through Shet is Hanoch, and this after the 4 generations of word for word monotonous repetition, you find Hanoch. First it starts that he lived, nothing special, but then, and he walked Hanoch with God. Something completely new. And was he days? He lived actually very few years, 365. In chapter 5, that is a very low number. I will not talk about the years now, but it's just a lot less. And walked Hanoch with God, and was no more, because God took him. Again, a very different ending. And the normal way to understand it is that the writer really says that Hanoch didn't die. God took him directly. This is at least a very big variation, and it comes, surprise, after 4 monotonous generations. So the contrast makes it even more of a surprise, noticed even more than if you have had the variations for every generation. This is a technique which is used quite often. Monotonous and variations to make the effect bigger. Also in generation 9 there's a new variation. Then it's Lamech who fathers Noah, and he called his name Noah, saying, "This will give us comfort from our work, yes, from the toil of our hands, with the ground that the Lord has cursed." This is very interesting. Do you remember, where have you heard this kind of language before, where the name of a person is explained, the reason for its name is explained? Yes, in chapter 4, about Cain, who got formed, got this man, and Shet, because God has given me this son instead of Abel, that Cain killed. So, and this is the P writer, according to the documentary hypothesis. Exactly the same way of explaining a name. Also interesting to say, the ground that the Lord has cursed. Where has God cursed any land, any ground? Yes, in the Toledot of heaven and earth, the story about Cain and Abel. Where is that found? In J, because J is considered to have written the story about Cain and Abel. And here you have in P, chapter 5 is considered to be P, the ground that the Lord has cursed. In P, there has not been a word mentioned that God, the Lord, had cursed something. According to the documentary hypothesis, is chapter 5 a direct continuation about the creation story, but the last what is said, it was very good when man was created. Everything was very good. Not a word about that God would have cursed anything or any problems whatsoever. And also notice the name, the Lord. The tetragrammaton is used, which of course should not be used in a P text before Exodus. So again, this is new variation, yes, but it's also something that would fit perfectly if it would be J. If it would be the same writer who has written chapter 4, or knows exactly about at least chapter 4. But according to the documentary hypothesis, that is not the way. So this is very natural, it's perfect. If you don't believe the documentary hypothesis, then this is a bit strange. You have a lot of things to explain. And then it continues with the normal formulation. Then generation 10, Noah. First it's told 500 years, and he fathered not one son, but 3. All the time up to now, it has been all the time one son. Here now it's 3, and then it stops. Half of the 2/3 actually of the formula is missing. Again, big variation. What is happening here? 3 sons named instead of 1. Why? Where's the end? It makes you wonder. It's really shocks the reader. Maybe a too big word to say shock, but it's very. After these 10 generations have ended the same way except generation 7. where is the end? And I think if you read the Primaeval story, you will find the end after the flood. There it said that Noah, how long he lived, and so on. There is a variation here also, but we don't have to talk about that now. So the end is after the flood. It also tells you something about the composition. The writer, or the editor, or whatever you want to call him, of course had the Noah's formula complete, of course, but he chose to put the end part after the flood story. And the flood story is in between parts of both B and J, if you listen to the documentary hypothesis. So if you conclude the genealogy, 6 of these 10 generations are actually, yes, they are identical word for word. Of course, different names, different ages, but otherwise. But not in generation 1, 7, 9, and 10. In these, there are actually 17 variations. Very many. And the writer is contrasting monotonous repetition with rich variation to gain wished effect, the effect he wants. I will not talk about it here, but if you want to read about my analysis about of Cain's genealogy, chapter 4, you will find it's the same structure. The writer have some monotonous generations, which he contrasts with a lot of variation. There are 13 variations, if I remember correctly. That is 7 generations, 13 variations. Here we have 10 generations, 17 variations. So it's the same number, same frequency about variations, the same techniques are used, even though there are no ages in chapter 4, for instance. That is the end of the genealogy of Adam, and this ends the first part of the unit. I will stop this film here, but in the next film I will explain about the 8 first verses in chapter 6. Notice that they are continuation of this same unit, but it's the genealogy above from Adam through Seth is now ended. So there's a lot of interesting things there. Sons of God, giants, and Nephilim. Who are they? Yes, the mighty ones. Who are they? What is meant by those first 8 verses? I think it's very interesting, so I hope to see you there.